Now, as promised, the news in detail. Let's start with our top story. Britain has rejected Iran's proposal to release a seized Iranian supertanker in exchange for a British vessel captured in the Strait of Hormuz. In an interview, Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab said Iran must follow international law. Meanwhile, Britain has strengthened its naval presence in the Strait of Hormuz with the deployment of a second warship. Both vessels will escort UK-flagged commercial ships through the Persian Gulf. In Vienna, meanwhile, Iran's nuclear negotiator Abbas Araghchi says the emergency meeting with parties to the 2015 nuclear deal was constructive. The urgent meeting in Vienna was requested by Paris, Berlin, London, and Tehran.
Iran, China, Russia, the UK, France, Germany and the EU met in Vienna to discuss how to save the accord. Tehran says the meeting was a good step, but it will continue to reduce its nuclear commitments if the Europeans fail to salvage the pact. Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said everything was not resolved despite commitments.
All remaining participants to the JCPOA are still committed and determined to save this deal, which is a big achievement of diplomacy in the recent years, and we will continue our efforts in that direction.
China's representative at the talks, Fu Kong, says all sides have expressed their commitment to safeguard the deal.
Second point I take away from this meeting is that all sides have expressed their strong opposition against the U.S. unilateral imposition of sanctions, especially their extraterritorial application of these sanctions.
Iran has breached the limit of its enriched uranium stockpile in response to the U.S. sanctions on Tehran.
Oman says it is not involved in any mediation to reduce rising tensions in the Gulf region. Foreign Affairs Minister Yusuf bin Alawi says Oman is in contact with all parties to maintain stability in the Strait of Hormuz. Alawi's statement came after his visit to Tehran and his meeting with Iran's President Hassan Rouhani. In an interview, he denied media reports that his visit was an attempt at mediating in the region's disputes. He says that Oman is concerned at the region's rising instability. Alawi called all countries concerned with the shipping lane to work together to avoid future conflicts. Let's move on now to Afghanistan, where President Ashraf Ghani has rejected the Taliban's proposed format for intra-Afghan talks. The Taliban have said they do not acknowledge the government's legitimacy. Speaking in Kabul, President Ghani said only the Afghan government has the authority to negotiate with the Taliban. Ghani said it should be clear to all that only an elected government can bring stability to Afghanistan. He said the Taliban will regret it if they fail to avail the current opportunity for peace. The Taliban said they will engage Kabul's representatives as a political entity at the planned intra-Afghan talks, but not as the government. Earlier, the Taliban rejected Kabul's claims that direct talks with the Taliban could begin within 2 weeks. Well, the death toll from the attack on the Kabul office of President Ashraf Ghani's running mate has risen to 20. 50 others were wounded in the attack on Amrullah Saleh's political office. The Interior Ministry said the attack began with an explosion, followed by gunfire. The violence came the same day as Ghani marked the official start of the country's election season. Ghani is among 17 candidates vying for the top slot. The twice postponed presidential votes are scheduled for September 28th. In Yemen, fighting has intensified after Houthi rebels shelled government military and residential sites in the port city of Hodeidah. A civilian was killed and 4 children were wounded in the attack in the Jareba area. The government coalition has responded with a series of airstrikes on the rebel-held capital, Sana'a. Meanwhile, Houthi rebels claim that they have launched a drone attack on Abha airport in southwestern Saudi Arabia. Houthi media says the attack hit vital facilities at the airport, causing a suspension of air traffic. Saudi Arabia has not yet confirmed that attack. 4 government soldiers have been killed by a landmine explosion in Syria's southern Sueda province. The Syrian Observatory says 10 others have been wounded in the incident. The War Monitor says landmines have killed over 120 people in former rebel-held areas since February. In the northwestern provinces, airstrikes by government and Russian forces have killed 10 others. According to War Monitors, 6 people were killed in Idlib. 2 others lost their lives in Hama, while 1 was killed in the city of Marat al-Noman. The UN says more than 400,000 people have been displaced by the violence in northwestern Syria over the past 3 months. In news coming out of Sudan, that country's ruling military and civilian protest leaders will resume decisive talks on the implementation of a power-sharing accord on Tuesday. The African Union mediator, Mohamed El Hassan, says the 2 sides have been invited to finalize a constitutional declaration. Protest leaders confirmed they will take part in Tuesday's talks on the installation of a transitional administration for 3 years. To discuss this further, we're now joined by our correspondent, Patrick Oya. Patrick, as always, thanks for joining us. Patrick, the military and protesters clashed again over the July 3rd Khartoum massacre investigation report. The military, too, is, of course, divided over this truce. With a number of dissidents on both sides, how sustainable can this agreement really be?
Yeah, it is something that is worrying the Sudanese people, of course, because of the disagreement over investigation on the killings that took place, the killing of the protesters. But this is something that is likely going to go on and on unless the African Union and Ethiopia, who are mediating these talks, come up with a concrete solution that the 2 parties will have to abide by, because there are so many issues now in the Sudan other than the issue of course, these representatives of the protesters and the Transitional Military Council agreeing. There are also other armed groups who are not part of the current arrangement. For example, it's known as the Sudan People's Liberation, have their own conditions and terms also that they want to be considered. So to take a lot of time on this discussion on how this issue should be investigated, and when it is investigated, for example, then those who were actually, or those who will be found culpable will have to be held accountable. This is something that many people think, yes, is good for purposes of accountability. But we know in Africa and Sudan in particular that when people are in power, even when they commit mistakes or when they make mistakes, it's very difficult to hold them accountable. These very people who ordered these kind of attacks are going to be part of the government that would come to power. How would you prosecute a minister who is holding a position? How would you prosecute a vice president or any senior government official? So it is likely that even if this is put in the constitutional declaration that yes, those who have committed crime, those who killed protesters, those who maimed, those who injured, if found to be guilty, will of course be held culpable. But who are culpable will be held accountable. But all the same, we have experiences that when people are in power, most of these reports are just reports that are going to come out. The public will even be, in most cases, kept unaware or ignorant of the report. So to insist so much on this, yes, it's good for accountability purposes, but sometimes it's dragging the whole peace process backward, and people want to move forward. So this week, the week has just started, but last week, the representative of all the teams were also in South Sudan, including the armed groups that are not part of this peace arrangement. They were in South Sudan on invitation of President Salva Kiir to actually agree on another ceasefire or cessation of hostilities, because, as I said, the armed groups are not part of this. Some armed groups are not part of this arrangement between representatives of the protesters and the Transitional Military Council. So this armed group, they need a separate arrangement, and there was arrangement. There was a cessation of hostilities agreement signed in April, but it's expiring at the end of this month. And there was fear that if this expires before a government is set up, then there could be fighting again resuming in parts of the country at the time that negotiations are going on. So they were in Juba. They have agreed to extend the cessation of hostilities for another 3 months, which is a good move. But also, they should also move the peace process forward so that peace comes and they start incorporating into the government, the other armed groups who are not part of this current peace agreement, so that peace resumes to the whole of Sudan.
Patrick, the demand of constitutional declaration will be fulfilled tomorrow. Does the Sudanese constitution not actually dictate civilian supremacy? And if it does, what makes this declaration any different than that?
The problem here is that for you to come to power, actually, according to the Constitution of Sudan, which we are still, or Sudanese are still using, is that you should be elected, So even the protesters who are now saying that, we want constitutional declaration to be like this, and they are coming to power. This is a temporary arrangement, by the way. This is a temporary arrangement. Perhaps a proper constitutional making process should actually come. That means they should actually put in this constitutional declaration that a proper constitutional process or a constitution-making process should be taken to the Sudanese people. Remember, these people who are coming to power now, they are not elected. There was a protest, yes, former President Omar al-Bashir was ousted, the military came in, and now with the representatives of the protesters are trying to form a government. But you cannot give that power to you. You cannot act like a government that is elected. This is a temporary arrangement. Whoever wants to come to power will have to come to power through the people of the Sudan who will elect their leaders. So you do not need to impose so many things on the people of the Sudan. That is how many people are looking at it here in Sudan.
In Nigeria, the death toll from a Boko Haram attack there on a funeral has risen to 65. A local militia leader says the mourners were shot dead in Naganzai in Borno State as they returned from a relative's funeral. Boko Haram fighters have intensified attacks on civilian and military targets in recent months. Last week, the group attacked a camp for displaced people outside Maiduguri. The decade-long ethno-religious violence has spilled into neighboring Chad, Niger, and Cameroon. The conflict has killed 27,000 people and has forced more than 2 million to flee their homes. On to the U.S. now, where 4 people have been killed and over 60 have been injured after a mass shooting at the annual Gilroy Garlic Festival in California. The unidentified shooter is still on the loose. The shooting at the California festival triggered a stampede, causing a high number of injuries. Police say at least 11 people suffered gunshot wounds. President Donald Trump has called on people to be careful because the killer is still at large. This comes hours after a shooting at a community event in New York killed 1 and wounded 11. The U.S. Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, has become the latest high-profile figure to leave the Trump administration. President Donald Trump said Coats will step down in mid-August. The two have often been at odds over Russia and North Korea. Trump has nominated Texan Congressman John Ratcliffe as the new intelligence chief. On to the UK now, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson is off to Scotland to seek support for his Brexit plan and to quell rising separatist sentiments. He will try to preserve the union by unveiling £300 million in extra funding for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But Scotland's Conservative Party leader, Ruth Davidson, has made it clear she won't back Johnson's no-deal Brexit plans. Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and her Welsh counterpart, Mark Drakeford, have also denounced the plan. Meanwhile, Trade Minister Liz Truss has pledged the National Health Service would not be up for sale. This comes ahead of negotiations on a free trade deal with the U.S. next month. Staying in Britain, Michael Gove, the newly appointed Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, says the government is now working on the assumption of a no-deal Brexit. Gove said his team still aims to reach an agreement with the EU. He wrote that Britain will exit the EU on October 31st with no ifs and buts, and Brexit is happening. Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson has made Gove responsible for preparing a no deal. Meanwhile, opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn has said he will do everything to stop a no-deal Brexit. Elsewhere, jailed Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny has been taken to hospital after developing a severe allergic reaction. This comes a day after almost 1,400 people were arrested at demonstrations called for by the opposition leader. Doctors say Navalny has been exposed to an unknown chemical substance. Navalny's personal physician, Anastasia Vasilyeva, says he is now suffering with swollen eyelids and multiple abscesses on his body. Navalny was arrested during protests in Moscow against the disqualification of opposition candidates. The Election Commission disqualified Navalny, President Vladimir Putin's rival, on technical grounds. The opposition have called for a serious inspection of hygiene standards at the jail. Well, Beijing has condemned the recent anti-government protests in Hong Kong, calling them horrendous incidents. China's Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office called on police to curb violence and restore law and order. Spokesperson Yang Guang accused irresponsible Western figures of promoting the unrest in Hong Kong. He reiterated China's support for embattled leader Carrie Lam. This comes after tens of thousands of pro-democracy protesters clashed with police near Saiwan and Causeway Bay on Sunday night. Pakistan's President Arif Alvi has formally invited Iraq's President Dr. Barham Saleh to visit the country. Pakistan's ambassador to Iraq, Sajid Bilal, has formally handed over the invitation letter to President Saleh. Means of promoting relations between the two countries came under discussion during his meeting with Saleh. The Iraqi president says Pakistan is an important player and plays a vital role in current issues. The Sri Lankan Navy, meanwhile, has arrested 7 Indian fishermen and seized their boat for allegedly fishing in its territorial waters. Indian officials say the arrested men have been taken to Mannar Naval Base for interrogation. Colombo has long complained of illegal fishing by Indians in its waters. It says this depletes Sri Lankan catches. Fishermen from both countries frequently stray into each other's territory and end up spending years in jails. Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh have refused to return to Myanmar unless they are recognized as an ethnic group by their government. They also demanded citizenship in 2-day talks between a government and 35 Rohingya leaders. This is the second time the government has sought to persuade Rohingya refugees to return to Myanmar, but Rohingya leaders have refused to return unless the international assurances.
It depend on the Myanmar government. If Myanmar our not agree, how we can?
With the news, Rome has refused to let 130 migrants disembark from its own vessel until a deal is struck with the EU. Italy's row with the European Union has added to the plight of migrants entering its port. An Italian Coast Guard vessel stranded in the Mediterranean was allowed to dock in Sicily after 3 days. From over 130 migrants aboard the Gregoretti, some were evacuated for medical attention. However, Italy's far-right Interior Minister Matteo Salvini barred the others from coming ashore. Italian laws have repeatedly trapped migrants in intra-EU disputes about where they should be allowed to land. In business news coming out of China, that country has expressed hope that it will reach a consensus with the U.S. during trade talks in Shanghai later this week. Trade negotiators from both sides will meet in person for the first time since talks broke down in early May. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying said the U.S. should fulfill its commitments for progress in economic cooperation. She said the two sides are working hard to agree on a deal. Earlier on Friday, President Donald Trump claimed China does not want to sign the deal before next year's elections in the U.S. Time now to find out what the weather is like around the world. And you're all caught up. Thanks very much for watching this bulletin here at Indus News.